The dark skies over the Solomon Islands during the Second World War presented a persistent, insidious threat to Allied forces. This menace was not always a massive daylight bombing raid, but rather a solitary, nagging presence that stole the most vital resource from weary fighting men: sleep. The psychological warfare waged by Japanese night intruders, often symbolized by the derogatory nickname Washing Machine Charlie, was profoundly effective. These nocturnal pests would circle just outside the reach of American anti-aircraft guns, occasionally dropping flares or small anti-personnel bombs. The singular goal of this harassment tactic was to maintain a state of anxiety, fear, and sheer misery among the defenders manning the perimeter, ensuring they remained awake and exposed. The consequences of this continuous nighttime stress were immediately apparent to senior leadership. When Rear Admiral William F. Halsey, Jr. arrived on Guadalcanal, codenamed CA Cactus, in the Solomon Islands on November 8, 1942, to inspect the conditions, he quickly noticed the overwhelming exhaustion plaguing the troops. He toured the front lines with 1st Marine Division Commander Major General Alexander A. Vandegrift, observing firsthand the strain of 3 months of nearly constant combat. An aide to the admiral vividly described the scene, noting the gaunt, malaria-ridden bodies of the Marines. Their faces were lined with exhaustion, reflecting what seemed like a nightmare lasting years. That very evening, Admiral Halsey experienced this living nightmare for himself. The harassment began when an enemy destroyer entered Iron Bottom Sound, exchanging shell fire with Marine artillery on shore, forcing the visiting admiral into an air raid shelter. Later, the distinct, unsynchronized sound of aircraft engines high overhead sent the Cactus defenders scrambling back into their bunkers. The raid by Washing Machine Charlie effectively robbed Halsey of any rest. In his own recollections written after the war, the admiral attributed his sleepless night not just to the noise, but to fright. He recalled trying repeatedly to command himself to sleep, labeling himself a damned coward, but found himself unable to obey his own orders. This unsettling experience underscored the critical operational need. Weeks later, the memory of that disturbed night led Admiral Halsey to propose a crucial remedy to Major General Ross E. Rowell, the commander of Marine Aircraft Wings Pacific. Halsey formally claimed that the ongoing night nuisance raids over Guadalcanal were actively lowering the combat efficiency of the troops. He directly linked the loss of sleep and the increased exposure to malaria suffered during the hours of darkness spent in foxholes and dugouts to this reduction. His recommendation was clear and urgent: dispatch a minimum of 6 night-fighting aircraft equipped with homing radars along with the necessary ground equipment to Guadalcanal as quickly as possible. However, the response from Washington revealed an embarrassing organizational gap. Major General Rowell forwarded the request to Lieutenant General Thomas Holcomb, the Commandant of the Marine Corps. Holcomb was forced to inform Halsey that the United States Marine Corps was simply unable to send 6 radar-equipped interceptor aircraft to Guadalcanal. Astonishingly, 1 year into the fierce conflict in the Pacific, the Marine Corps did not yet possess a single operational night fighter. The establishment of night fighting capability within the United States Marine Corps faced monumental challenges. As historians later recounted, in the beginning there were no suitable planes, no trained pilots, and crucially, no American precedents for this specialized form of combat. Recognition of the dire need for night fighters was minimal, and the available equipment for locating enemy aircraft was extremely primitive. If the Leathernecks were ever to successfully intercept hostile aircraft during the critical hours of darkness, they would require substantial assistance and a complete shift in technological thinking. The development of effective night fighting capability was inextricably linked to revolutionary advances in radio wave technology. By 1941, the British Royal Air Force had already achieved significant breakthroughs in perfecting an early warning system that fundamentally changed aerial warfare. This system utilized radio waves to accurately determine the distance, direction, and speed of incoming warplanes.
This innovation was, of course, radar, an acronym standing for Radio Detection and Ranging. This technology played a crucial and arguably decisive role in the Battle of Britain, fought the previous summer. The need to counter relentless nocturnal bombers spurred British scientists to rapidly develop an ingenious microwave radar system. Crucially, this system was compact enough to be mounted inside a high-performance aircraft. With this airborne radar, night fighters could operate under a refined system of control. They would first be precisely guided toward a target by Ground Control Intercept, or GCI, stations. Once close, the flight crew could utilize their own short-range air interception, or AI systems, to close in on the enemy aircraft for the final attack. The Royal Air Force had already been utilizing radar-fitted Bolt and Paul Defiants in this specialized role, achieving modest success. Recognizing the necessity of adopting this specialized knowledge, United States Marine Corps Major Frank H. Schwable was assigned orders in November 1941 as a special military observer to the United Kingdom. Schwable, who was 33 years old and a 1929 graduate of the United States Naval Academy, had already earned his aviator's wings and served as a Marine pilot in Nicaragua and with the Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics. Before his departure for England, Major Schwable received detailed instructions. He was tasked with gathering all available information regarding the organization and operations of the Royal Air Force night fighting squadrons. His particular focus was on the operational routine, squadron training, gunnery techniques, and tactical doctrine. Schwable spent 3.5 intensive months in the United Kingdom, even attending the Fighter Director School located at Stanmore, before a new assignment called him back home the following spring. While Major Schwable was overseas absorbing the fundamentals of night combat, preliminary work on the United States Navy and Marine Corps night fighter program began domestically. Permission was granted for the license building of air interception and ground control intercept radars within the United States. These sets were officially designated the SCR-540 for airborne use and the SCR-527A for ground stations. In March 1942, Commandant Holcomb issued a directive for the activation of 8 12-plane United States Marine Corps night fighter squadrons. However, demonstrating the relatively low initial priority assigned to this specialized field, the first of these squadrons was not scheduled to take wing until January 1, 1945. It was evident that the higher echelon of the Marine Corps did not initially regard night fighter operations as a high-priority endeavor. However, that summer, the freshly promoted Lieutenant Colonel Schwable utilized the knowledge gained overseas to help persuade headquarters. His efforts were successful, resulting in the activation timeline for these squadrons being pushed forward by 3 critical years. Thus, on July 25, 1942, Marine Night Fighter Squadron VMFN 531 was officially authorized. Frank Schwable was designated as its first commanding officer, and the unit was slated to organize and train at Cherry Point Marine Air Station, a facility then being constructed out of a North Carolina swamp. The beginnings were extremely basic. Lieutenant Colonel Schwable later recalled that the squadron literally started with nothing. They were the very first combat squadron to move into one of the new hangars at Cherry Point. Conditions were so severe and austere that Schwable's personal office, which was relegated to the corner of an unheated shed, was furnished with nothing more than 3 packing boxes that served simultaneously as his desk and his chair. New personnel steadily arrived to join the fledgling unit. Among the first to report aboard were Majors John D. Harshberger and Robert O. Beeson. Major Harshberger, an early proponent of night fighter operations, served as the second in command. Major Beeson, although a qualified aviator, was placed in charge of Marine Night Fighter Squadron VMFN 531's Specialized Ground Control Intercept Detachment. Both Harshberger and Beeson soon received promotions to lieutenant colonel. This unusual arrangement, featuring 2 lieutenant colonels alongside the commanding officer, reflected the large size of the new organization and the highly technical, specialized nature of its mission. Typically, a Marine Corps fighter squadron would be led by a single major as its commanding officer. This was clearly anything but a typical unit, as the men, who soon became known by their squadron nickname, the Gray Ghosts, were quickly learning.
While organizing the personnel and training regimen, Frank Schwable faced the critical challenge of securing an aircraft that his squadron could realistically take to war. The purpose-built night fighters were simply not ready. The Northrop P-61 Black Widow, a large warplane intended specifically for this role, was already plagued by numerous design problems and would not become operational until late 1944. Single-seat United States Navy interceptors such as the Vought F-4U-2 Corsair and the Grumman F-6F-3EN Hellcat, which were planned to be fitted with air interception radar, were set to reach the fleet possibly as early as the middle of 1943. However, even that time frame was not soon enough to meet the immediate operational need in the South Pacific. The search for an interim solution was so desperate that a proposal was even floated, possibly by Schwable himself, to request a dozen radar-equipped British Bristol Beaufighters through a reverse lend-lease exchange. Ultimately, the United States Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics, the agency responsible for supplying aircraft to the Marine Corps, decided on a highly modified version of the Lockheed Vega PV-1 patrol bomber to fulfill this requirement. The Ventura was a twin-engined aircraft that typically carried a crew of 3, a pilot, a radar operator, and a top turret gunner. It was deemed suitable because it stood at the top of a very short list of airplanes capable of carrying aloft the bulky SCR-540 air interception radar set. Despite its selection, converting the 12 PV-1s destined for Marine Night Fighter Squadron VMF-N 531 would consume months of valuable time. Nonetheless, the flight crews required immediate practice in the essential skills of nighttime navigation, takeoff, and landing. In October, the Grey Ghosts acquired 2 North American SNJ-4 trainers and 1 Curtiss SNC-1 trainer aircraft. Yet they needed more planes to accommodate the growing number of newly assigned Marine aviators, most of whom had just arrived directly from flight school in Pensacola, Florida. In December, the squadron received several Brewster SB-2A4 Buccaneer Scout bombers. These aircraft had been repossessed from a contract originally intended for the Royal Netherlands Air Force. To put it mildly, these Brewsters immediately became a great source of trouble for the squadron. The problems were manifold and sometimes bizarre. First, the instrument panel placards in the Brewsters were all written in Dutch. Their electrical contacts for the propellers frequently burned out, and worse, the main landing gear struts often collapsed upon landing. A staggering list of in-flight failures occurred within a mere 14 days. One SB-2A4 suffered a hydraulic failure, another shed its tailwheel locking pin, a third had its control stick completely lock up, and a fourth terrifyingly snapped both rudder cables. Lieutenant Colonel Schwable was forced to ground the dangerously defective Brewsters until his mechanics could perform a comprehensive overhaul on every single aircraft. A critical skill that every night fighter pilot had to master was flying blind, meaning being entirely reliant on instruments for control and navigation. Although Marine Corps aviators received basic instruction in all-weather navigation while at Pensacola, far more specialized training was necessary for night interceptions. Major Carl S. Day, a reservist, ran an intensive attitude instrument flight school located in Fort Worth, Texas, utilizing Douglas R-3D3 Skytrains. The Grey Ghosts attended Day's rigorous course, emerging with a new confidence in their fundamental ability to fly an aircraft without any visual reference outside the cockpit. Simultaneously, Marine Night Fighter Squadron VMF-N 531's ground controllers were mastering the intricate, highly technical business of guiding, or vectoring, a fighter aircraft toward a specific interception point. Once at this point, the flight crew would take over using their own short-range radar. Getting a night fighter to the ideal interception position was defined as placing it 600 feet astern and slightly below its prey, maintaining the exact same course and speed. This was an exceptionally difficult task, especially considering the temperamental and primitive electronics then in use. The process demanded constant, relentless practice. Whenever the weather allowed, the Grey Ghosts were aloft in their undependable Brewsters, meticulously following the ground control intercept vectors to locate a target plane flying somewhere deep in the darkness.
Throughout the spring of 1943, Marine Night Fighter Squadron VMF-N 531 continued to organize, train, and wait for the specialized equipment needed for combat. However, the crucial PV-1 Venturas, delayed by extensive difficulties with the conversion process, still had not arrived at Cherry Point. These aircraft were scattered across the East Coast. They first traveled to a depot in Norfolk, Virginia, where 6 nose-mounted 50-caliber machine guns and a gun sight were installed in each plane. They were then routed to Quonset Point, Rhode Island, to be fitted with the SCR-540 radar and Identification Friend or Foe, or IFF, transponders. These top-secret electronic interrogators were vital for communicating with ground and ship-based stations, allowing controllers to distinguish friendly aircraft from enemy targets within the chaos of combat. The extensive installation and conversion process demanded a great deal of time. By June 2, the Grey Ghosts had only 3 Lockheed Venturas on hand, and remarkably, none of them worked properly. Pilots lodged serious complaints about a poorly positioned gun sight mount that obstructed their view of the altimeter and frequently vibrated loose during flight. The newly installed radar sets often malfunctioned, and the oxygen and electrical systems also proved highly unreliable. It seemed that every single day brought forth a new, unanticipated problem with the PV-1 Venturas that required fixing before the squadron could possibly ship out. Clearly, the squadron was nowhere near ready to meet its projected overseas movement date of July 15, 1943. Lieutenant Colonel Frank Schwable diligently kept his superiors informed of these discouraging developments through a series of technical reports. He detailed the PV-1's inferior performance at altitude, writing that it took 45 to 55 minutes just to climb to 20,000 feet. Furthermore, he noted the aircraft had very little maneuverability above 15,000 feet and possessed very slow acceleration and level flight above 10,000 feet. In all official correspondence, Lieutenant Colonel Schwable characterized the Lockheed PV-1 Ventura as nothing more than a makeshift night fighter. His personal notes, written while he was en route to Hawaii, revealed the depth of the squadron commander's doubts about the deeply flawed warplane his leathernecks were taking into battle. He wrote pessimistically that they only stood a chance to shoot down the Japanese if the enemy was more stupid than anybody thinks they are and came down to 15,000 feet, and even then only if the Ventura could fly fast enough to catch them. Schwable componted that if they lacked the necessary speed, expert vectoring might help, but if the Japanese chose to fly thousands of feet higher than the physical limits of the marine planes, there was not one damned thing on God's green earth they could do about it.
Despite the substantial shortcomings of their assigned equipment, the Grey Ghosts committed themselves to making the absolute best of what they possessed. Due to the continuing troubles with the hastily modified Venturas, the squadron was obliged to deploy in 3 separate groups, commencing on August 1st. 6 PV-1s and their flight crews sailed from San Diego aboard the escort carrier USS Long Island. Other vessels transported the main ground echelon and the essential ground control intercept detachment into the South Pacific. All remaining air crewmen were scheduled to follow once their respective fighters finally became operational. Toward the end of August, Schwable and Harshberger arrived on Guadalcanal. There, they learned that their squadron now operated under the command of Marine Air Group 21, designated MAG-21. The 2 officers also observed for themselves how much the situation had evolved in the 9 months since Admiral Halsey had first sent up his urgent request for night fighter support. By this time, a detachment of United States Army Air Force's Douglas P-70 Havocs was already guarding this major Allied staging base against nocturnal prowlers. Furthermore, 6 radar-equipped United States Navy F-4U-2 Corsairs from Fighting Squadron VFN-75 were expected to arrive any day at a forward airstrip located on Vella Valella, some 250 miles to the northwest. The overall strategic situation was also changing rapidly. American, Australian, and New Zealand forces had been aggressively seizing a series of strategic islands as they relentlessly marched up the Solomon's chain toward the massive Japanese base cluster centered at Rabaul, New Britain. Some military objectives, such as Munda on the island of New Georgia, necessitated a full-scale invasion force to clear out the entrenched enemy defenders before construction engineers could build the vital landing fields and supply depots. Other islands, known as stepping stones on the route to Fortress Rabaul, specifically Vella Valella and the Russell Islands, had not been occupied by Japanese troops and were consequently transformed into Allied outposts with relative speed. Admiral Halsey had now shifted his primary strategic focus to the island of Bougainville in the northern Solomons. Landings at Cape Torokina were scheduled for November 1. However, the invasion fleet was acutely vulnerable to enemy night intruders, particularly the fast, well-armed Mitsubishi G4M1 Betty bomber aircraft flying out of Rabaul. Large numbers of HE-E-13A Jake floatplanes also represented a persistent nocturnal threat to the unarmored American transport ships necessary for the invasion. To help counteract this very real menace, the Grey Ghosts deployed to Bonica Airfield, situated in the Russell Island Group, beginning on September 11, 1943. Once established, the squadron mechanics commenced an immediate and highly irregular weight control program. They began stripping their Lockheeds of de-icing equipment, cabin heaters, and armor plate in a desperate attempt to increase the aircraft's high-altitude performance. This extreme measure resulted in each Ventura being lightened by as much as 1,000 pounds, leading to a noticeably improved airspeed and rate of climb, crucial factors in catching high-flying bombers.
Lieutenant Colonel Schwable personally flew Marine Night Fighter Squadron VMF 531's initial night patrol on September 16th. This date also marked the squadron's first battle loss. Lieutenant John E. Mason, Staff Sergeant Ralph W. Emerson, and Corporal John J. Burkett disappeared while conducting a routine patrol near Guadalcanal. An extensive air search in the aftermath failed to turn up any sign of the missing PV-1. Throughout the remainder of September and all of October, the flight crews completed 47 sorties and made 17 interceptions of Japanese aircraft over Bougainville. Despite the high number of contacts, they failed to score a single kill. This dismal start to combat operations was attributed primarily to a combination of crew inexperience, a lack of proper ground control coordination, and pervasive poor maintenance. Logistics compounded their operational difficulties. Marine Night Fighter Squadron VMF 531 found itself stuck at the very end of a long and strained supply chain. Compounding this issue was the fact that they were the sole United States Marine Corps unit equipped with the PV-1 aircraft. Often the only feasible way to obtain vital repair parts was to beg or barter for them from neighboring Royal Australian or New Zealand Air Force squadrons that also operated the Ventura. Replacement radar components had to be wheedled out of United States Army stocks held on Guadalcanal. The maintenance personnel faced an unrelenting and largely unrecognized struggle merely to keep their planes flying and the complex radars functioning. In the meantime, Lieutenant Colonel Bisson's crucial ground control intercept technicians had been detached from the squadron. They were operating in support of the Bougainville invasion from Picoy Bay, situated on the northwestern end of Vela Vela. On October 31st, Marine Controllers Major Thomas E. Hicks and Staff Sergeant Eugene J. Gleason successfully directed United States Navy Lieutenant Hugh D. O'Neill of Fighting Squadron VFN 75 against a marauding Mitsubishi G4M1 Betty bomber aircraft. This engagement resulted in the first successful air-to-air victory achieved by a radar-equipped night fighter within the Pacific Fleet. The Grey Gusts finally secured their own place on the scoreboard at 418 hours on November 14th. A Ventura named Coral Princess was successfully coached onto an enemy plane by fighter directors operating from a destroyer. The PV-1's radar operator, Technical Sergeant Charles H. Stout, achieved initial contact with the target, a Betty bomber from the 702 Kokutai based at Rabaul, at a range of 6,000 feet. Maneuvering in for the kill, the pilot, Captain Dwayne R. Jenkins, and the top turret gunner, Sergeant Thomas J. Glennon, fired 3 bursts that instantly sent their prey plummeting into a fiery death dive approximately 50 miles southwest of Bougainville. Tragedy, however, followed quickly. Jenkins, Stout, and Glennon were all lost in action just 3 weeks later. On December 3rd, the Coral Princess and her crew rushed to aid a friendly convoy that was under attack by a large force of 15 to 25 Japanese bombers and torpedo planes. Shoreboard observers reported seeing at least one enemy aircraft, likely a Betty belonging to the 751 Kokutai, fall in flames to Jenkins' guns. Shortly afterward, all radio and radar contact with the Coral Princess ceased. No trace of the aviators or their Lockheed Ventura was ever found. A complete all-marine interception occurred shortly after midnight on December 6th. Ground Control Intercept Controller Captain Owen M. Hines brought Squadron Executive Officer Lieutenant Colonel Harshberger's PV-1, named Gertie the Goon, into position directly behind a twin-float Jake from the Buka-based 938 Kokutai flying over Bougainville. Harshberger's crew consisted of radio operator Technical Sergeant James S. Kennan, gunner Staff Sergeant Walter E. Tideman, and a co-pilot, First Lieutenant Wilbur E. Birdsall. Approaching within 800 feet of the bogey, both the pilot and the gunner simultaneously unleashed a burst of 50 caliber rounds that immediately set the Japanese plane ablaze. Ground witnesses subsequently confirmed this aerial victory. Beginning in December, the Grey Ghosts began undertaking frequent night harassment missions. For these sorties, the Venturas were armed with 100 or 500-pound bombs. Targets included enemy camps situated beyond Allied lines at Bougainville, as well as crucial resupplied barges sailing back and forth from the nearby Shortland Islands. Harshberger, known as an especially pugnacious warrior, greatly enjoyed these bombing raids. In contrast, Schwable preferred to utilize his PV-1s in their intended role as night fighters.
The combination of the cerebral Schwable and the fiery Iron John Harshberger proved to be an effective command partnership. Together, they fostered a command climate equally dedicated to technical precision in interception and aggressive action in combat. 3 additional Lockheeds, along with their flight crews, arrived at Banica in the middle of December. Their presence helped alleviate the considerable burden of flying 3 to 5 nightly patrols and harassment missions. Typically, the squadron commander and his executive officer were both flying twice every single night, in addition to managing their substantial administrative responsibilities. Training the newly arrived aircrewmen also consumed a considerable amount of Lieutenant Colonel Schwable's time. After nearly 4 months in active combat, the Grey Ghost's leader had accumulated well over 100 flying hours without achieving a single kill to his credit. That long dry spell finally ended on the evening of January 12, 1944. That night, Schwable, along with radio operator Staff Sergeant Robert I. Ward and gunner Sergeant William T. Fletcher, took their PV-1 named Chloe out over Empress Augusta Bay near Bougainville. Their first 2 radar contacts that night were lost when the enemy aircraft vanished into a cloud bank. However, at 956 hours, Ground Controller Captain Thompson S. Baker successfully vectored Chloe's crew onto a 3rd bogey, located 12 miles away and heading northwest. 5 minutes later, Ward acquired the target on his radar scope. The aircraft was identified as a Nakajima B-5N Kate torpedo bomber belonging to the air group of the carrier Zukaku. Schwable and Fletcher sighted the enemy aircraft visually at a range of 3,000 feet. Closing rapidly to within 500 feet of the Kate before opening fire, their point-blank barrage ignited the torpedo bomber's fuel tank. Banking hard to avoid the massive explosion, Schwable recalled distinctly feeling a scorching heat as his right wing cleared the flaming mass. This successful interception perfectly illustrated the effectiveness of well-trained ground controllers and flight crews working in concert to locate, approach, and ultimately destroy enemy intruders. Unfortunately, poorly disciplined United States Navy gunners frequently interfered with the Grey Ghost's missions. Marine officers found it incredibly difficult to convince their naval counterparts that while the shipboard anti-aircraft gunfire boosted morale, these constant pyrotechnic displays actually knocked down far fewer Japanese bombers than the specialized night fighters. Frank Schwable personally recalled that he got shot at oftener by friends than by the enemy. On January 30th, the final Lockheed Ventura destined for Marine Night Fighter Squadron VMF N531 finally arrived in the theater of operations. With the critical ground control intercept detachment now set up on a new forward base in the Treasury Islands, the squadron's air echelon moved forward to Baracoma Airfield, located on Vela Vela. The PV-1s began operating from Baracoma just 2 days later. Frank Schwable scored his second kill on the night of February 5th through 6th. United States Army controllers successfully steered Chloe into position directly behind a Betty bomber belonging to the 751st Kukutai, which was flying high over Dampier Strait. Pushing the Ventura to its absolute maximum combat ceiling of 15,000 feet, Schwable and his gunner saturated their target with 3 decisive bursts of 50 caliber gunfire. The Betty subsequently fell off into a vertical spin. Wreckage and an oil slick were discovered the following day, confirming their aerial victory. The squadron suffered a major loss on February 9th. The PV-1, carrying First Lieutenant Clifford W. Watson, Staff Sergeant Jack H. Shirk, and Sergeant George E. Brona, crashed upon takeoff during severe weather conditions at Baracoma. There were no survivors. Later that same night, Lieutenant Colonel Harshberger and the crew of Gertie the Goon engaged a dangerous enemy over Empress Augusta Bay. Vectored onto a bogey at 0329 hours, Harshberger strained his worn-out Lockheed Ventura to reach the target's reported altitude of 15,000 feet. At a range of 2 miles, radar operator Technical Sergeant Kinnan acquired the enemy aircraft on his scope and guided the pilot in for the attack.
As Harshberger's Ventura neared its quarry, Kinney observed his radar image mysteriously split into 2 distinct blips. This indicated that there was, in fact, a pair of Japanese planes operating together.
The top turret gunner quickly confirmed this visual sighting. Sergeant Tideman positively identified them as two Bettys flying in an extremely tight formation, only 2,000 feet ahead of them. As Harshberger approached the two heavy bombers, both Japanese aircraft opened fire on him simultaneously with their 20mm tail cannons. The incoming enemy fire disabled 5 of his 6 nose guns and knocked out a radio set mounted immediately behind the pilot's head. Despite the damage, his gunner engaged the 2 enemy aircraft. The gunner put one burst into the tail gunner of the Betty on the right, which then peeled off right out of range, according to the official aircraft action report. Tideman then swung back on the bogey to the left and fired 3 bursts. This second Betty, also from 751 Kokutai, started to glow internally and took on the chilling appearance of a brightly lit sieve before nosing into a fatal dive. Returning to Barakoma, the crew of Gertie the Goon was nearly out of fuel and had lost radio communications. They were forced to endure a barrage of friendly anti-aircraft fire before managing to land safely. Harshberger, energized by the intense action, summed up the harrowing mission simply, "Never had so much fun in my life." February proved to be an exceptionally eventful month for the Grey Ghosts. On the 15th, Lieutenant Colonel Schwable and his crew successfully downed a Jake floatplane. 2 nights later, they shot down another Jake. Both floatplanes belonged to the 938 Kokutai. This marked Frank Schwable's 4th and final kill. After accumulating 269 combat hours and 72 missions, his time as squadron commander reached its conclusion. On February 18, 1944, Iron John Harshberger officially took charge of Marine Night Fighter Squadron VMF-N 531. The new commanding officer immediately led by compelling example. Harshberger successfully brought down another Jake over Bougainville on February 19th. That same night, however, First Lieutenant Thaddeus M. Banks, Staff Sergeant Burnell C. Bowers, and Sergeant Gilbert Jones went missing in action during a low-level barge hunting sortie. After sunrise the following morning, search aircraft identified fragments of their Lockheed Ventura floating in the Solomon Sea. While the Grey Ghosts maintained a busy schedule of night patrols and harassment raids, the enemy now seemed notably reluctant to send aircraft out at dark. Apart from a Jake shot down by First Lieutenant Jack M. Plunkett, Staff Sergeant Floyd M. Pullum, and Staff Sergeant Michael J. Sipkala on February 19th, there had been no successful interceptions recorded over Bougainville for nearly a month. Harshberger, operating out of an airstrip on Torquemada, scored his final victory of the war on March 14th. Together with Kenny and Tideman and Gertie the Goon, Iron John Harshberger executed a daring head-on pass against a twin-float seaplane that they mistakenly identified as an Aichi E-16A1 Paul. Post-war records later confirmed that this was, in fact, another Jake from the 938 Kokutai. The enemy aircraft immediately disintegrated under their concentrated 50-caliber gunfire. The squadron's war diary recorded a great tragedy on March 21st. The entry read that Lieutenants Pierce and Birdsall flew formation towards Vella Valella when, about 0630, Lieutenant Pierce's wing clipped Lieutenant Birdsall's wing. Lieutenant Pierce's PV-1 immediately burst into flames. Lieutenant Birdsall's plane went into an uncontrolled spin. Witnesses stated that both aircraft crashed into the sea, resulting in the deaths of 8 crewmen.
Marine Night Fighter Squadron VMF-N 531's strenuous tour of duty in the South Pacific was drawing to a close. The squadron recorded no hostile contacts throughout the entire month of April. Newly arriving United States Navy and Marine outfits, flying the far faster and more capable Grumman F-6F Hellcats or Vought F-4U Corsairs, began taking on an increasing number of the critical night patrol missions. On May 6th, Lieutenant Colonel Harshberger formally relinquished command of the Grey Ghosts to Captain James H. Wimmer and finally headed home.
Iron John's remarkable record of achievement included 4 confirmed kills. Additionally, he accumulated an amazing 756 combat hours across 100 missions. Both Harshberger and Schwable, having served as the true pioneers of United States Marine Corps night fighter operations, were each awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for their exceptional exploits over Bougainville. The squadron managed to achieve one final air-to-air victory. On May 11th, the pilot, First Lieutenant Marvin E. Notestein, the radar operator, Sergeant Edward H. Benintende, and the gunner, Corporal Walter M. Kinn, chased an unsuspecting Jake into Rabal's Simpson Harbor. They blasted their target out of the sky as it was preparing to make a water landing. This kill, the 12th achieved by Marine Night Fighter Squadron VMF N531, was notably the only one accomplished without the aid of radar guidance. The Gray Ghosts flew their final combat mission over Rabaul on July 14th. Following this mission, the squadron undertook a lengthy trip back to the United States. The unit was formally disbanded at Cherry Point that September. However, it did not remain dormant for long. On October 13, 1944, Marine Night Fighter Squadron VMF N531 was reactivated with orders to move to Marine Corps Air Station Eagle Mountain Lake, Texas. There, it was scheduled to become the first United States Marine Corps unit to field Grumman's cutting-edge F-7F Tiger Cat night fighter. Although Japan surrendered before the Gray Ghosts could take their hot new interceptors into battle, Marine Night Fighter Squadron VMF N531's record of service during World War II remains remarkable. At the high cost of 6 PV-1 Venturas and 20 crewmen lost in action, the squadron received official credit for a total of 12 aerial victories during its 10-month tour of duty over the Northern Solomons. The combat tour of the Gray Ghosts provides essential insights into the rapid adaptation necessary for modern technological warfare and the extraordinary human capacity to overcome severe material limitations. The primary achievement of the squadron was not merely the final tally of 12 kills, but the establishment of a foundational doctrine and the demonstration that night aerial superiority was achievable, even with deeply flawed equipment. The limitations of the Lockheed PV-1 Ventura were profound and undeniable. Lieutenant Colonel Schwable's assessment that the PV-1 was entirely unsatisfactory as a night fighter was the blunt consensus among the crews who flew it. The aircraft struggled with high-altitude performance, exhibiting very little maneuverability above 15,000 feet and slow acceleration at those critical heights. Yet despite these structural handicaps, the maintenance crews, ground controllers, and flight crews devised operational procedures that maximized the limited capabilities of the aircraft. The drastic, unofficial weight control program, stripping the aircraft of insulation, heaters, and armor, was a direct response to the Ventura's inability to perform optimally at the altitudes where the Japanese bombers often operated. This resourcefulness in the face of logistical deprivation highlights a key theme. As the sole United States Marine Corps unit flying the PV-1, the Gray Ghosts endured an isolation that complicated maintenance exponentially. The necessity of begging and bartering for spare parts from Australian and New Zealand allies and wheedling components from the United States Army stocks underscores the immense, unrecognized strain on the maintenance personnel. Their relentless and often thankless efforts were directly responsible for keeping the squadron's few unreliable aircraft in the air and their temperamental radars functioning. The success of the Gray Ghosts fundamentally rested on the synergy between the air crews and the ground control intercept teams. The process of vectoring a night fighter required the highest level of coordination and precision. The ground controllers, utilizing the SCR-527A radar apparatus, had to guide the pilot from miles away into a perfect attack position, 600 feet astern and slightly below the target. This technical precision, developed through constant practice under Lieutenant Colonel Bisson's direction, was the crucial enabler of the unit's eventual kills. The narratives of the successful interceptions demonstrate the high-stakes danger involved. Captain Jenkins' first kill on November 14, 1943 against the Betty was guided by both ship and shore personnel. However, the most vivid illustration of the partnership came with Lieutenant Colonel Harshberger's February 9, 1944 mission. In that dramatic engagement, Technical Sergeant Kinn's radar observation of the two blips splitting the image, indicating the two Bettys in formation, allowed the crew to anticipate the attack. Harshberger's pilot skill, combined with Gunner Tiedemann's ability to successfully engage both planes despite suffering severe damage from 20mm cannon fire, was a testament to the aggressive doctrine instilled by both Schwable and Harshberger.
The presence of the Gray Ghosts achieved a major strategic objective that went far beyond this simple count of 12 destroyed aircraft. Rear Admiral Halsey's initial request was motivated by the desire to restore troop combat efficiency, which was being destroyed by fatigue and increased malaria exposure due to nuisance raids. By the end of the tour, the squadron had effectively ended the unchallenged dominance of Japanese night harassment. The establishment of reliable night patrols protected critical Allied staging bases such as Guadalcanal and Vella La Vella and provided essential defense for the vulnerable amphibious landing fleets preparing for the crucial operations around Bougainville. The transition in command from Lieutenant Colonel Schwable to Lieutenant Colonel Harshberger in February 1944 marked the natural evolution of the unit. Schwable, the foundational organizer and technical skeptic of the PV-1, accumulated 4 kills before departing. Harshberger, the aggressive operational leader, also recorded 4 confirmed kills. Together, their combined leadership defined the squadron's ethos of technical rigor married to fierce combat engagement. The history of Marine Night Fighter Squadron VMFN 531 serves as a powerful case study in military innovation under duress. Starting with nothing, no planes, no doctrine, and primitive equipment, the unit had to rapidly acquire technological expertise from the British, develop complex operational procedures for ground control intercept, and fly a fundamentally inadequate aircraft. Their success demonstrated that disciplined, specialized training and courageous execution could mitigate severe technological disadvantages. The challenges faced by the Grey Ghosts highlight the continuous, brutal cycle of wartime technological development. The PV-1 Ventura, though a failure as a long-term night fighter platform, served its essential interim purpose until superior purpose-built aircraft like the Grumman F-7F Tiger Cat could be fielded. The eventual shift to the Tiger Cat symbolized the culmination of the lessons learned by Schwable, Harshberger, and their crews. Lessons bought at the high price of 6 Lockheeds and 20 lost crewmen. The Grey Ghosts proved that the combined skill of pilot and radar operator, tightly controlled by sophisticated ground guidance, was the indispensable element in conquering the night sky. Their pioneering efforts ensured that the era when Washing Machine Charlie could fly undisturbed over South Pacific skies was permanently over.
The process of modification was complicated and slow. The sequential fitting of 6 50 caliber nose guns in Virginia, followed by the installation of the radar and identification friend or foe transponders in Rhode Island, illustrates the fragmented and hurried nature of the conversion. The subsequent arrival of the aircraft at Cherry Point with persistent mechanical and electronic failures, from vibrating gun sights to malfunctioning radar, further delayed the squadron's combat readiness. These issues were not minor inconveniences. They were existential threats to the crews who would later rely on these systems in pitch-black combat. The specialized training undertaken by the pilots was rigorous and essential. Mastery of instrument flying, the ability to operate entirely without external visual cues, was paramount. The intensive school run by Major Carl S. Day provided the aviators with the confidence needed to navigate the darkness. Simultaneously, the ground control intercept teams mastered the arcane art of vectoring, converting blips on a radar screen into precise instructions to guide a fragile, fast-moving aircraft. The margin for error was tiny, aiming to place the fighter just 600 feet below and astern of the target. This combination of technical expertise in the air and on the ground defined the unique skill set of the night fighter community. The initial combat deployment in late 1943 immediately exposed the Grey Ghosts to the harsh realities of the South Pacific campaign. Landing at Bonica Airfield, the first step the maintenance personnel took was a calculated risk, sacrificing protection and comfort for performance. The removal of armor plating, de-icing equipment, and cabin heaters to shed up to 1,000 pounds per aircraft was a desperate attempt to gain a slight edge in altitude and speed. This demonstrated an awareness that their lives depended less on the scant protection the aircraft offered and more on their ability to actually reach the enemy. The early months of September and October were frustrating and fruitless. The tally of 47 sorties and 17 interceptions yielded 0 victories, emphasizing the difficulty of integrating the primitive radar technology with inexperienced crews and the inherent flaws of the aircraft. The logistical isolation, being the sole PV-1 unit, exacerbated maintenance issues, making the procurement of simple repair parts a complex exercise in inter-service diplomacy and bartering. The turning point was marked by the successful coordination demonstrated by the Marine ground controllers assisting the United States Navy's Fighting Squadron VFN 75 on October 31, 1943. This success validated the ground control intercept procedures developed by the Marine Corps. 2 weeks later, the Grey Ghosts achieved their own breakthrough. Captain Dwayne R. Jenkins' kill on November 14th not only provided the squadron with its first victory, but proved that the combination of the PV-1, the radar, and the vectoring doctrine could function effectively under fire. The subsequent operations were defined by a series of tense, often brutal tactical engagements and unavoidable operational losses. The disappearance of Jenkins and his crew on December 3rd, only weeks after their initial triumph, served as a stark reminder of the lethal environment. The night fighting mission was inherently dangerous. Operating at high speeds, in total darkness, often against multiple enemies or while targeting dangerous resupply routes, carried catastrophic risks. Lieutenant Colonel Harshberger's engagement on December 6th, resulting in the successful downing of a Jake floatplane, underscored the need for multiple eyes in the cockpit. His most dramatic encounter, the February 9th duel with two Betty bombers, is a classic example of night fighter heroism. To push Gertie the Goon to its 15,000-foot maximum ceiling and then deliberately engage two well-armed heavy bombers flying in tight formation was an act of extreme aggression. The ensuing damage, with 5 nose guns disabled and a radio knocked out, highlights the vulnerability of the aircraft, which lacked heavy armor, especially after the weight reduction modifications. Harshberger's elated remark upon landing safely, "Never had so much fun in my life," captured the unique adrenaline-fueled nature of this high-risk combat. Lieutenant Colonel Schwable's personal breakthrough on January 12, 1944, against the Kate torpedo bomber after over 100 fruitless combat hours illustrated the difficulty and frustration inherent in the job. The near miss and feeling of scorching heat from the explosion demonstrated the necessity of immediate, violent maneuvering required to survive the close-range attacks necessitated by the PV-1's limited radar capabilities.
A constant operational hazard beyond the enemy was the risk of friendly fire. Schwable's complaint that he was shot at oftener by friends than by the enemy reflects a critical inter-service coordination problem. Shipboard anti-aircraft gunners, driven by the psychological need to fight back against nocturnal attackers and lacking full visibility, often fired indiscriminately. The Marine officers struggled to convince their naval counterparts that these morale-building pyrotechnics were often targeting their own interceptors and achieved little military benefit compared to the radar-guided fighters. By early 1944, the Gray Ghosts, operating from Baracoma Airfield on Vella La Vella, represented a fully matured combat capability. The continued attrition of Japanese night raiders, combined with the harassment bombing raids that forced enemy resupply barges to operate under greater risk, contributed to the overall Allied strategic success in the Northern Solomons. The eventual decline in hostile contacts through April, leading to the squadron's replacement by units flying faster, purpose-built aircraft like the Hellcat and Corsair, confirmed that the tactical requirement had been met. The enemy had been effectively deterred. The legacy of Marine Night Fighter Squadron VMFN 531 is etched in its pioneering role. The squadron achieved 12 confirmed aerial victories at a significant cost. More importantly, the Great Ghosts established the doctrinal blueprint for all subsequent United States Marine Corps night fighter operations. The partnership between the ground control intercept technician and the airborne crew, developed and proven in the dark skies over Bougainville and the Russell Islands, became the standard for protecting amphibious forces both afloat and ashore. The courage and technical proficiency of the officers and men, especially the pioneers like Schwable and Harshberger, recognized by the award of the Distinguished Flying Cross, provided the necessary foundation for the Marine Corps to transition into the next generation of radar-equipped aircraft. They successfully transformed a neglected mission into a critical, high-technology capability, forever altering the dynamics of aerial warfare in the Pacific. The relentless, exhausting terror of Washing Machine Charlie was replaced by the vigilance of the Gray Ghosts, ensuring that the tactical advantage of darkness was no longer solely the property of the enemy.